Hello guys, ever since the stay alert, get back to work change from Boris, the college have put out this new treatment grid, and I've been working through protocols about getting back to work, and part of that obviously is considering this treatment grid and how it works and how we can triage patients. So you'll notice that the college has said this is not an exhaustive list, and your clinical judgment following patient risk assessment also needs to be taken into account. So what we're doing with triage is a patient risk assessment. So this is what the college has given us with this very useful red, yellow, green treatment grid. Kind of, in my mind, it's the wrong way around, but anyway, I suppose you can think of it as acute or urgent is red, but I kind of think of it as green means go and red means stop. But anyway, red means that you can treat because of the acute conditions once you've taken other things into account. The orange or the amber means that you can treat with certain conditions, and the green means that you probably shouldn't treat, but there may be some reasons why you could. And then they give you a decision tree which you work through, but you can see right at the beginning there you screen out the people that are going to be a hazard to us and to other people if they came to our clinic, those people with infection or being in the presence of people with COVID infection. You can see that at the bottom there it says if there's any other reason that would cause the patient to be susceptible to foot infection, breakdown, severe pain or similar if left untreated currently and cannot be seen via remote consultation. I think that kind of leaves a lot to our own discretion, which I think is very good. But just so that we could maybe, or I could at least, get a better idea of how I can do that risk assessment, because that's what a triage is, I set about kind of looking, sort of doing a reasoning project, and I like to sort of work on paper like this and spread it out so I can see all what's going on all in one go. So the aim of the assessment is for triage, and the triage sorts out into some sort of hierarchy of need, of injury and disease, and within that we look at their importance, their relevance, their benefit and the ability to treat. And we put that on some sort of scale of morbidity and mortality, like what's the risk of that disease causing health problems and what's the risk of it causing death. But this is mostly about your or our, as a clinician, perspective on the patient, but also nowadays we're obliged to take in the patient's point of view, which is known as autonomy or patient-centered decision making, and we find that paternalism, like we know best, is on decline and autonomy is on the rise, and within all that there are a whole range of ethics to consider when we're making these decisions. And you can see there autonomy, benefit, justice, etc. But we want to know that they are kind of true, those sort of conclusions that we come to have got some truth. So we kind of have to ask the question, is our risk assessment, is it justified truth, or how do we come to be justified? So this, I sort of split it up into justified and virtuous. I put truth underneath because it's a kind of, can we know truth? I don't know. Anyway, but there are forms of inquiry with questions and answers that lead to knowledge with a probability that it's right, and some sort of confidence we have in our ability and the methods that we use that would produce that to be something along the lines that we could call truthful. So we have a decision-making process. If we look at this still again in terms of justified and virtuous, one side, we're both kind of finding knowledge, but one side goes down the route of absolute truth, or some sort of idea that we could find truth from this method, like from the scientific method. Or there's the other side where we sort of got useful truth, which is helpful, beneficial and evolving. In terms of triage, we want something which is pretty quick. We don't want to have to wait for scientific research and experiment and statistical analysis to tell us in a year or two that this person's okay for treating because he's probably died by then, or his foot's fallen off, or he's just gone home. So anyway, in terms of the triage, it still needs to be rational and justified and prompt. It needs to be responsive and effective and relevant. And so what kind of evidence can we use towards that? So we've got this, again, we've got this splitting off of how we make our decision. We can make a scientific based decision, which tends to lead to truth perhaps, but it takes a long time, but it also tends to lead to doubt, because you're always saying, no, I never really know, because I always have to keep testing it. But the pragmatic decision, it kind of relies on what you know and your experience and skills, and plus also taking something from the scientific empiricism to feed into all the knowledge that you have to make a useful decision, which has useful action, which tends to confirm what you thought. In other words, the outcome tends to confirm what you thought or not. So if it doesn't, then you have to maybe go back to more the scientific side, and if it does work out how you expect, you can carry on with that until you kind of find out something different. So what is this in terms of the COVID risk? We're looking at what is the concern, and we've got kind of two things. We need to be safe, but we need to be effective. And so the concern is that in close proximity with no barriers, that it leads to infection of others. But what's the outcome of those infections? They can be severe, or they can be mild, or they might be death. So who do we need to protect? We need to protect the patient and the clinical staff. The clinical staff are protected by screening out those people who are infected or being in the presence of infection, and then we use barriers and PPE and distance, both in time and space. We also want to avoid litigation and blame. So we protect the patient in a similar way to we protect our staff, but it's more about effective barriers and education and information. But in terms of the litigation, it's kind of, how do we know what to do? Should we do nothing? In which case we don't need to go through all this. We just decided we're not going to do anything, so we don't need to even consider all that. Or we're going to do something which requires that we do consider all that. And then we have to understand the proper employment of the risk assessment, and sort of basically it means what's the risk of doing nothing compared to doing something. So what I done was I looked at how risk is characterised in the literature, and it's often put down as absolute, crude, relative, or odds ratio, or hazard risk. We often see that. So the absolute and the crude are very similar in that they're just like a person's risk within a population or a section of a population. It's usually out in 10,000. So what's your risk within 10,000? It might be 5 in 10,000. Whereas the population, within a population, you might have a 5% risk or something, or a 1% risk, or 0.5% risk, anything like that. So the relative risks and the odds ratio, they compare one thing to another, whereas the absolute and crude just like one thing. What's the risk of this? This says what's the risk of this if something else. So what's the risk of me getting lung cancer if I smoke? That would be the relative risk. Or if I've got lung cancer, what's the likelihood or the odds that I smoked? That would be the odds ratio. And then the hazard risk is some reference to a reference group, which has often got a risk of 0.5 or 1 to 1, and then you sort of grade others against that, so it gives you some intuitive way of knowing how to grade your particular group. But we're not always doing, we're almost never doing risk for populations or groups, so it's always an individual that comes to us with an individual problem. So we have to sort of adjust what we know about groups into individual. Look at exposure. So the exposure to the risk and exposure from the risk. So exposure to infection, if you're not going to be exposed to it, then you've got no risk perhaps. And if what's the exposure from it? If you do get exposed, how will that work out? Exposure to is not quite as simple as that, because you can still have lung cancer and not be exposed to smoking. In fact, in Britain, it's about 1 in 6 who have lung cancer never smoked. You've got the hazard v the benefit, and within those two you've got probability and intensity. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what is the COVID risk for the individual? How do we think about that? We've got the exposure to, as I said before, that applies to everyone or anyone. And the infection, the individual risk. So the exposure 2 risk is people will be sheltering or isolating or going out. So how does coming to podiatry change that? That's kind of a yes or no answer. Does it change it or doesn't it? The individual effect is relative, is the kind of relative risk level in terms of age, comorbidity and gender and social considerations. You can see from there, like, age makes quite a difference. If you're very young, under 30, then you've got almost no chance of dying and very low chance of actually getting the disease, even if you were infected. You know, if you had a positive test, you may still not have any symptoms. Then there's comorbidities. There's no kind of formal gradings for that as such, but ERS, this ERS paper, Guan et al. They looked at some of those things in terms of COVID. They found that diabetes and hypertension were quite high risks, and in fact hypertension is the highest risk. And then they graded others around that, and COPD, well, I don't know if they graded it around that. They gave other risks hazard ratios of 1.5 to 3.5. And then you've got gender, male and females, they're not equal. Lifestyle, if you're unfit smoker, heavy drinker and fat, that's going to put you at high risk. And in fact, one paper found that obesity might be even more of a risk than diabetes. Black and Asian ethnicity, that's a higher risk there, and also low income kind of plays into the obesity thing. They have a high risk, very similar to people who are obese. And then key workers we have to consider in terms of their of them being put in a higher rank. What's the word I'm looking for? You know, key workers, they get seen anyway. So just coming back to that hazard, risk and benefit. If we put 2 things into the hazard of COVID and the benefit of treatment, and we can look at that in terms of probability and intensity. What's the probability of the hazard occurring, and if it does, then what's the intensity, the outcome of that? So we can sort of like put it into scores of 1, 2 and 3. I've done it like that because it ties in with the 1, 2, 3 red, amber, yellow, amber, green rather of the treatment grid. So you could have someone with a very low probability of being exposed, or the risk exposure is very low, but if they did get it, intensity would be very high, so you'd have a 1 and a 3. The 1 might say, oh well, that's not too bad, they can come in, but the 3, if they did, then the likelihood they might die might be very high. And you can make a little grid and work out from adding up multiplying the numbers on either side of that to get a score, which gives you an idea about that risk. And then we have a look at the benefit. What's the benefit of the treatment? What's the probability of the benefit? So if we treat them, will it give them any benefit, and what sort of level will that be? It could be very high probability that it will do them good, but the intensity of that goodness might be very low. You know, you could, on the other hand, it might be very unlikely that someone's going to benefit in terms of probability, but if they did, then the intensity of that would be very high. And then you've got 2 in the middle, which is kind of half and half. So if we look at how we re-triage for the COVID, taking these things into account, then if we make those all the same kind of gradings, red, amber, green with 1, 2 and 3, and we've got the treatment grid, so we make our decision about what score we're going to give that person if they come within there. Then we've got the individual COVID grade risk, which takes into account comorbidities, and we say, oh well, we'll give them that grade, 1, 2 or 3. Then we might take account that the patient has made their own decision about whether they want to come or not, or if they're unsure. If they say no, they don't want to come, obviously we can't force them, and we shouldn't do, and we shouldn't try and convince them. If they're yes or unsure, then we should give them enough information to make sure they've made the right decision. In terms of yes might be a very optimistic view, and we might have to put forward some reasons why you might rethink that, and if they're unsure, we can sort of give them information so they can be sure, which might make them go to yes or no. Then we come down to the change in exposure to risk infection. So if they're already going out, then coming to us doesn't change their exposure risk. But if they're voluntary isolating or on a shelter order, it does change it. So you've got to know a yes there, but it sort of goes 1, 2, 3 still, because the voluntary isolating, they might be doing that because they visit their mum once a week or something, so they want to avoid the possibility of getting an infection, and so it's not quite such a high thing as if you're on a shelter order where you shouldn't go out at all, and we shouldn't really convince someone they should, perhaps. Then we can consider some of those scores in an objective and subjective way to make a decision. Obviously, making those scores is subjective in many ways, but the score itself is objective. So we can then go over to this part here, which is kind of the final one. Hooray, say. So we've got the treatment grid risk and the individual Coved risk, so TGR and ICR. So if we put those in scores in a grid table like that, and we multiply across 1 times 1, 2 times 2, 3 times 3, we get numbers. And if we put that down as a decision to treat, if it's 1 and 2, if it's 3 and 4 is a caution, and 6 and 9 is a no-ish, unless there's something else which convinces you there should be. And then you could multiply that score by the change in exposure score, and then the same for the patient decision. Or you could take those two things and you could do the same grid, take the score of that and multiply it by that that risk score at the top, and get some figure that gives you an idea about whether you should treat or not. Obviously, changing sort of subjective measures into objective measures is still kind of subjective, and it still needs you to think about how we're going to do that, or me to think about, you know, why I'm making that decision. But you could write these things down and make it quite a justified way of describing or you know, justifying why that you have made that decision. And for me, it kind of makes it clearer. I can sort of go through that, I can come to that decision, and I can make some minor adjustments around it, but I can show why I've made that decision with that system, and that I have considered a system as well. I don't know if that's going to help you. Maybe it's too complicated or too long. Hopefully you'll be able to get back to work. Just one last thing on that the general feeling is that we shouldn't treat people that are just coming in for routine treatment, but I would say that once we've gone through this whole process from right up here, working through, you know, obviously once we work through that triage process, that patient is no longer really routine, because they didn't just come in on a time and get treated. They came in, or they were screened and triaged on the phone, and then they came in and they were triaged again. So their safety measures there are quite high, and part of a risk assessment is what safety measures have you put in place. Obviously, this whole thing is a safety measure, and the other safety measures are, again, going back to the things we put in place, which are the to protect staff and that from infection, which are the barriers and the screening and the distance and the triage, of course. So I kind of would say, you may be able to say, maybe you want to get back to me and discuss that once you've done a triage like this and you put everything in place, then no customer is really could be regarded as routine. What do you think about that one? Okay, thanks then. Bye bye.